sat high above them all, velvet robes draped over his shoulders, a golden ring around his finger, and a pen that decided the fate of men. Sisamnes was not just a judge, he was the law, or Dachtai. But in ancient Persia, under the reign of King Cambyses II, justice had no mercy for those who betrayed her, especially not when they wore her crown. It began, as most downfalls do, with a whisper. A bribe slipped into the wrong hands, a decision sold, and a king who found out. Cambyses didn't rage, he didn't scream. He simply gave an order, one so cruel, so unforgettable, that it would outlive marble, ink, and memory itself. Because when Sisamnes accepted gold in exchange for justice, he didn't just break the law, he became the sentence. In every great empire, rot begins in silence. Beneath golden halls and marble pillars, behind robes of wisdom and titles of honor, corruption often thrives in the shadows. The Persian Empire was no different. Judge Sisamnes held a seat of immense power. Appointed to interpret the king's law, he had the final word in matters of land, conflict, inheritance, and death. In the eyes of the common people, he was a figure of divine authority, one whose word could ruin a life or save it. But behind this mask of justice, Sisamnes had a price. Bribery in ancient Persia wasn't uncommon, especially among the elite. Landowners, merchants, and nobles knew that silver could tilt a verdict, and Sisamnes became one of many who played along. He accepted gold for favorable judgments, ignored truth for influence, and allowed personal gain to poison his courtroom. He believed himself untouchable, a judge above judgment. But in the court of King Cambyses II, no one was beyond reach. The king's rule was absolute, and he viewed the judiciary as sacred. To Cambyses, the law wasn't just a set of rules, it was order itself, the spine of civilization. And when that spine bent under greed, it had to be broken. Sisamnes was caught not in secret, but in public shame. His acceptance of a bribe was exposed, and the king made no effort to hide his fury. This wasn't just one man's fall. It was a betrayal of the empire's very foundation. Corruption, in this case, was not a quiet crime. It became a national offense, and Cambyses knew exactly what message had to be sent. Sisamnes's fate would be a mirror, not just for other judges, but for all of Persia to look into. What they saw would not be justice, but a reminder. When the law is sold, punishment becomes spectacle. Some men fall by sword, others fall by silence. But Judge Sisamnes fell by silver. It wasn't a grand betrayal. There were no whispers of rebellion or overt treason, just one bribe, one choice, one coin too many. But that was all it took to tip the scales, not just of justice, but of fate. In the bustling courts of Persia, where petitions were endless and decisions held lives in their balance, the judges were gods in human form. And gods, it seemed, could be tempted. A wealthy litigant, unnamed by history, approached Sisamnes with an offer. A sum of money, hidden behind flattery and urgency, meant to sway a decision. Sisamnes didn't hesitate. He took the bribe. He changed the verdict. And in that moment, he chose gold over duty, self over state. It was a private transaction, but Persia would never forget it. King Cambyses II ruled with an iron mind and a deeper rage for betrayal. To him, a corrupted judge was worse than a thief, because he stole trust, the very lifeblood of civilization. When news of the bribe reached Cambyses, he did not delay. He summoned Sisamnes, not to a trial, but to a sentence. The king made an example of him before any defense could be spoken. Because this wasn't just about guilt, it was about message. The courtroom where justice was bought would now become a theater of horror. Sisamnes's crime was simple, but the punishment would be anything but. In the king's eyes, a single bribe had cracked the entire spine of justice, and the only way to fix it was to carve the lesson in flesh. What came next would haunt Persia's legal memory for centuries. It was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a warning. There are kings who forgive, and there are kings who remember. Cambyses II, son of Cyrus the Great, was not a ruler known for patience. He was shaped by empire, war, and legacy, a king who believed that fear was a more loyal servant than love. So when he learned that one of his own judges had sold justice for gold, his response was not quiet. It was fire. The offense committed by Sisamnes was more than personal betrayal. To Cambyses, it was a disease in the heart of the empire. And diseases, when left untreated, spread. They infect the innocent. They rot entire systems. So Cambyses made a choice, not just to punish the man, but to burn the lesson into the conscience of Persia. There was no trial, no mercy, just a public summons and a king's fury on full display. Sisamnes was dragged before the court, the same court where he once passed judgment. But this time, the eyes that once feared him now looked on in grim silence. No robes, no dignity, just a man exposed. Cambyses delivered the sentence himself, not through a decree, but through design. A punishment crafted not merely to kill, but to haunt. The order was clear. Flay him alive. Strip his skin inch by inch. Let the people hear his screams. Let the empire watch what corruption looks like when the mask is torn off. Cambyses did not just want retribution. He wanted a memory. Something that would last longer than a verdict, longer than a reign. Something eternal. With Sisamnes bound and the knives prepared, the king's wrath was no longer a rumor. It was a ritual, and the courtroom that once echoed with judgments would now echo with agony. What does justice look like when it's stripped of robes and mercy? In the court of Cambyses, justice was not blind, it was brutal. Sisamnes, once a respected judge, once the voice of law, now stood as the condemned. His crime? Selling justice. His punishment? A spectacle, and not behind closed doors. No. Cambyses wanted every citizen, every official, every trembling judge to see what happens when the law is betrayed. The executioners began their work slowly. Skin was peeled from muscle in long, deliberate strokes, starting from the face, so his identity could never be forgotten. Then the arms, the chest, the legs, flayed alive, nerve by nerve. Each scream was a sermon, each drop of blood, a warning. He did not die quickly, that was the point. In ancient Persia, executions weren't always just punishments. They were performances. And Cambyses had orchestrated a masterpiece of fear. Crowds gathered. They didn't cheer. They didn't speak. They watched, silent, frozen, as the man who once passed sentences was now sentenced by the blade. But the king wasn't finished. Sisamnes' skin, soaked in blood and guilt, was collected and preserved. It was then nailed to the judge's chair, the very seat he once ruled from. The message was painfully clear. Judgment doesn't end with words. It lives in consequences. The court was left with a ghost, not a spirit, but a symbol, one stitched from flesh, from failure, and from the rage of a king who would not allow the law to rot under gold. And from that day forward, every judge who sat in that chair would feel the weight of the punishment carved into its very surface. Justice in Persia had a new face, and it was skinless. Some thrones are built from gold, others from conquest. But in ancient Persia, one throne was built from flesh, a grotesque reminder of what happens when justice is sold. After Sisamnes was flayed alive before the eyes of the empire, his execution did not end with death. It was only the beginning of his legacy. King Cambyses II ordered that the judge's skin be stretched, tanned, and carefully nailed to the seat he once occupied, the judge's throne. There it remained, not hidden away in a dungeon or burned with the body. It stood proudly, openly, as a symbol, a throne that no longer offered power, but served as a warning. The courtroom became a shrine to consequence. Each time a new judge approached that seat, they didn't just see a chair, they saw what remained of Sisamnes, they saw the cost of corruption. But the lesson wasn't only meant for the judiciary, it was meant for the people. The throne of human skin told a story without words, one etched in gore and silence. A story that said, the law sees all, and when it's betrayed, justice will take more than your life. It will take your place. To ensure the message endured, Cambyses went one step further. He appointed Otanes, the son of Sisamnes, to fill the seat his father had once disgraced. And so, the son judged over the same court, sitting atop the remains of his own father. Imagine the weight of each ruling, each verdict passed with blood at your back, each decision haunted by the screams of the man whose skin lined your chair. This was not just punishment. It was a systemic reminder, a living moral etched into the bones of governance. In Persia, justice was no longer just a concept. It had a shape, it had a smell, it had a throne. In the aftermath of blood and screams, there was no celebration. There was only silence. And in that silence, a new judge was named. Otanes, the son of Sisamnes. A man born from the same blood that had soaked the courtroom floor, now commanded to sit on the very seat his father once ruled from. A seat now wrapped in human skin, his father's skin. King Cambyses II did not choose Otanes by accident. It wasn't forgiveness. It was strategy. Where fear alone could not reach, legacy could. Cambyses didn't just want judges to fear justice. He wanted them to feel it, in their blood, in their bones, in their families. Otanes accepted. He sat upon the throne of flesh, fully aware that every judgment he passed would echo through the same chamber that once held his father's final cries. He knew what happened to men who bent the law for coin. He had seen it flayed into history. Under Otanes, the court grew quieter. Decisions were cautious. Verdicts were careful. The room that once whispered of bribery now trembled under the weight of memory. But was Otanes truly free? Or was he ruling as a prisoner of spectacle? Every glance from the audience, every motion in the courtroom, all reminded him that he ruled not by his own merit, but by the fear of what had been done to his bloodline. The throne beneath him groaned, not with wood or age, but with the weight of a legacy soaked in pain. Otanes became more than a judge. He became a symbol of obedience, of dread, of a justice system built not just on laws, but on viscera. Through him, Cambyses spoke long after the knives were cleaned. Through him, the message endured. The law does not forget. Some lessons are taught through words, others through scars. But in ancient Persia, justice was etched in the only language no one could ignore: flesh. The execution of Sisamnes was not designed to be forgotten. It was carved, displayed, and preserved, a grotesque memorial that turned a courtroom into a temple of fear. The judge's flayed skin, stretched tight across the chair he once ruled from, didn't just mark a man's downfall. It redefined justice. In a world where corruption was often hidden behind robes and rituals, Cambyses II had dragged it into the light, stripped it, flayed it, and nailed it in place. This wasn't a warning written in ink. It was a message written in blood. And the people listened. From that moment on, every judgment passed in that court came with a silent echo. The echo of torn flesh, of screams echoing down stone corridors, of a king's wrath made permanent. The throne was no longer just a seat of authority. It became a symbol of consequence. Judges who followed did not sit in comfort. They sat in fear, fear of gold, fear of weakness, fear of what the law could do when betrayed. Cambyses had redefined punishment, not as revenge, but as a permanent act of instruction. And in doing so, he blurred the line between justice and cruelty. Was it righteous, or was it barbaric? That question lingered in the eyes of every man who sat on that skin-wrapped throne. But the king didn't care for philosophy. He cared for control. And through this execution, through this chair, through this human parchment nailed into the seat of power, he ensured that corruption would never again wear the mask of respect. In Persia, justice no longer spoke. It bled. Some stories are written in books, others are whispered through generations. But the tale of Sisamnes, the flayed judge, became something else entirely. A symbol, a warning, a myth. What began as a brutal execution under King Cambyses II didn't stay confined to the marble halls of ancient Persia. It outlived the king. It outlived the empire. And like all powerful tales, it took on a life of its own. Artists painted it. Historians recorded it. Philosophers debated it. The image of Sisamnes, being skinned alive, his body stretched across a judgment seat, became more than a cautionary tale. It became a visual gospel of punishment. To some, it was a masterpiece of justice. To others, it was tyranny dressed in righteousness. But everyone remembered it, and that was the point. The throne wrapped in human skin became a metaphor for corruption exposed, for law sharpened into a weapon, for the terrifying power of rulers to shape morality through fear. In medieval Europe, centuries later, Flemish painter Gerard David immortalized the execution in oil and canvas. The scene was vivid, Sisamnes screaming in agony as his skin is peeled, while in the background, his son Otanes delivers justice from the very chair crafted from his father's flesh. The message was clear. Judgment remembers. Even today, the myth remains a powerful image in discussions of justice, punishment, and authority. Sisamnes has appeared in law lectures, political arguments, and modern fiction, not as a man, but as a concept, a symbol of what happens when those entrusted with truth sell it to the highest bidder. In a world constantly negotiating power and punishment, his story still asks one question. How far should a society go to defend justice? And at what point does justice become terror? Time forgets many things. Names fade, stones crumble, empires fall. But some warnings, they echo. The tale of Sisamnes, the corrupt judge skinned alive by order of Cambyses II, has echoed for over 2,000 years, through palaces and parliaments, courtrooms and classrooms. Not because it was just cruel, but because it was deliberate. This wasn't just an execution, it was a lesson cast in blood and preserved through fear. And history paid attention. Artists reimagined it, monarchs studied it, philosophers dissected it. The throne wrapped in human skin, grotesque and unforgettable, became a reminder that justice, once compromised, cannot be trusted quietly back into power. Sisamnes's punishment wasn't hidden in dusty scrolls. It was displayed in paintings, echoed in sermons, and referenced in the darkest corners of legal doctrine. Even centuries later, his name is invoked when power is abused and when the price of betrayal demands to be remembered. In a modern world obsessed with law and ethics, this ancient horror still lingers, because beneath all the rituals of justice lies a simple truth. Trust is fragile, and when it breaks, the people demand more than an apology. They demand a symbol, a consequence, a warning carved into history, and that's what Sisamnes became. He became the embodiment of accountability, twisted into legend not just for his crime, but for what was done to make sure it never happened again. Was it justice? Was it vengeance? Or was it something else entirely? A warning so loud, so brutal, it outlived its own time. In the end, the story of Sisamnes is not just about a man. It's about a line, the one between power and abuse, truth and betrayal. And it's a line written not in ink, but in skin. Thank you for joining us on this chilling journey.
If stories like these intrigue you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.
We'll be back soon with more shadows from the past